Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the St. Paul Area Chamber of Commerce Equity Brief. Want to acknowledge the season that we are all in the midst of. We are in a crossroads of time that is really exacerbating a lot of the challenges that we face as a society. As you all know, we've dealt with the pandemic of COVID. We've had economic decimation with nearly 1 out of every 4 citizens currently unemployed. And now the historical racism that has plagued our society or shaped our society is on Main Street, with people calling out, asking to be heard and seen. And this group is a group of champions seeking to drive change, to make a difference. You being here makes a difference. As always, our conversations at the St. Paul Area Chamber of Commerce are focused on action. What can we do? How can we be a part of the solution? And I am told, and I say that jokingly, that back in the 70s, there was a saying that was, together we can make it happen. And all of us are needed to make it happen. If we are not part of the solution, we are a part of the problem. If we see something and we don't say something, we are complicit. So our goal is to better understand what it means to see and to be a part of it. There are so many nuances and elements to inequity, and throughout the work of the Chamber and the work of equity, we've tried to highlight where we can make a difference. And today we're talking about economic investment. And we know that there are significant economic disparities among Black people, people of color, and that in our state of Minnesota, people of color work rate at the bottom of all states, among the bottom, for the widest economic disparity gap. And so justice in economics is also important. I do want to acknowledge the loss of George Floyd as well as others. And we know that in our hearts and minds are the families and all of those who have been affected. And for all of us who want to again make change, let us do something in honor of George Floyd. I am Shannon Lemon, Vice President of Economic Development at the St. Paul Area Chamber of Commerce. And again, you are at the Equity Group. And it is a bite-sized conversation, and we have a lot to cover. We would not be here without our presenting sponsors and our other sponsors, so we thank Bremer Bank for its support. We cannot be at the Science Museum, although we wish we could, but we appreciate their support as our venue sponsor. Our program sponsor is Bush Foundation, doing great work in racial equity and diversity and inclusion. Our corporate sponsors, Anderson Corporation, Anchor Paper Company, Flint Hills Resources, Land O'Lakes, Flax Corporate Ventures, Redpath and Company, Travelers, Excel Energy. Our contributing sponsors, Sunrise Banks and the University of St. Thomas, and we thank all of them for their support. As I said, this is a bite-sized conversation. We're gonna lay a foundation, have some context, there will be some dialogue, and then we're gonna walk away with action. None of this work is possible without wonderful people, so I wanna acknowledge Faith Line, who is behind the scenes, driving our conversation today from a technology standpoint, and wants to present Anika Ward, our moderator for this discussion, who brings such great context and lays such great foundation for what we're doing. So without further ado, presenting Anika Ward.
Good morning, and thank you for that introduction and opening, Shannon. Thank you all for being here. I want to thank the St. Paul Area Chamber, Shannon, and B. Kyle for hosting this discussion and bringing us together for this important dialogue that becomes more and more clear for more and more Minnesotans and folks in our region every day, how important this discussion is. This discussion has been centering for all of us our role and responsibility as leaders in business and community for creating an equitable and inclusive region. And today is our 5th bi-weekly equity brief. And as you all know, for those who have been in this discussion on a regular basis, throughout the series of dialogues that we've been having, there's so much happening within our world, within our country, within our state and our cities that highlights and shines a spotlight on the importance of this discussion. The discussion around equity. We are facing a worldwide pandemic that is showing us so many ways that there are inequitable impacts on people of color and low-income communities. And it's making us realize in ways that we haven't, making us all open our eyes in ways that we haven't before on how important it is that we're all in the business of creating equity and health across the country and in our communities. And now, today, recently, we have experienced as Minnesotans watching this hurtful, unacceptable killing of George Floyd at the hands of the police officers. And we know that it's unavoidable for us to now have discussions as a whole, as a community, as a state, about issues that only some parts of our communities have had to constantly have discussion about. Over-policing, disproportionate minority contact, and the issues faced by communities of color and the Black community in particular. For Minnesotans, there has been a point where some folks have been having these discussions on a regular basis, and now we are capturing the attention of not only the country, but of the world. I just saw a New York Times article that says I think the headline was how Minneapolis, one of America's most liberal cities, struggles with racism. And then yesterday, I believe it was, Time had an article that said George Floyd's death and the long history of racism in Minneapolis. And so we are being pulled into, whether we want to or not, whether it's been part of the dialogue that we've been having within our work, within our families, within our institutions or not, Minnesotans are being called out and pulled into a dialogue and asked, what are we going to do? So we're now having to figure out how to have conversations, for those who haven't, with our families, with our children, within our schools. And the conversation within our businesses has to happen as well. There's no avoiding it. Businesses have been impacted and will continue to be in various ways. So today, the conversation about economic equity is so important. We remember from all of our conversations that it's one thing to recognize these inequities that are happening in our communities and these inequities that we face as organizations. It's another thing to recognize our role and our responsibility and to act with intention. We know that the disparities that we're facing, we've talked about this, we've heard from speakers about this, we're very intentionally baked into our laws, our policies, and our practices, and we're still, as a society, trying to unravel and pull those out. We know, and we talked about this as a group, that in order to build more equitable outcomes, we're gonna have to think just as hard about how we bake equity into this work. And so the challenge today is for us to build a vision. We can talk about the issues and the difficulties we have and the problems we're experiencing, but we must create a vision that's equitable and engaging and inspiring, and we must take action. So today's conversation I'm excited to introduce a leader in economic equity. I am fascinated and so appreciative of the role of her organization in building a more equitable Minnesota and region. Juhi Pomplun joined the Alliance staff, the staff of the Alliance, Advancing Racial Equity, in May of 2017. She was formerly Director of Policy and Advocacy at Asian Economic Development Association, where she worked with Asian communities along the Central Corridor, and Botany Transitway to open greater opportunities for wealth building via entrepreneurship, individual financial capabilities development, social lending, and governmental policies and practices. Juhi founded and organized the Health Equity Working Committee, a coalition of community-based organizations serving and led by Asian, African, African-American, Latinx, American Indian, LGBTQ, and allied communities seeking accountability of government to advance health equity. She also served as the executive director of the Minnesota Asian American Health Coalition. Juhi has a bachelor's in women's studies, a master's in public health, and is a certified massage therapist. Her strengths and interests are in the intersection of community development, racial equity, and spiritual health. Without further ado, I am so appreciative to ask Juhi to join us today. Good morning, Juhi. Juhi, I think we need you to unmute.
Yes, sorry,
There.
thank you. So thank you for that generous introduction. And also for, just kind of recognizing what's happening in our cities right now. I think we absolutely have to take a moment and really, and just, and say his name and recognize the unjust deaths and harm that perpetually have been happening in our Black communities here and nationally. And so I just want to say his name and take a moment of silence where we can think about the Black lives in our lives that have been impacted. So George Floyd. Thank you. It impacts me personally, and I'm confident it's impacting all of you, and it hurts. It really hurts, and I have some words. The conversation today I want to have is really what the role of our businesses are in building our communities. So in economic equity, what is the role of our businesses into supporting our communities? And some of the things I just want to say about the murder of George Floyd is that in the end, it was over $20, right? We all know it was a forfeited, or what do you call it? A fake $20 bill got called in. And I don't even know if we know that George Floyd was the person that used that money at that store. But, I think there are so many layers of implicit racism and white supremacy within that scenario that led to George Floyd's murder and death, where a business, I'm a massage therapist on the side. I accept lots of cash for the work that I do. And I would never know if I had a counterfeit, dollar. And I wish that there was a bit of forgiveness to know that people don't know when things are counterfeit. I wish there was a forgiveness and space to have a conversation with a Black man rather than make an assumption that he is going to be dangerous and I don't want to confront him. And I wish that the police force just wasn't so complicit in the brutality and violence that it inflicts on our communities on a daily basis. And so there's so many layers beyond that as well that, it's mind-blowing and hurtful, and that is why people are on the streets. It's not the root of the destruction that's happening on the streets, but that is why people are angry on the streets. And so I'm going to move from that to just talking about today's topic of business and economic equity. So if we could go forward. I don't know how we're going to do a conversation. We don't have our chat box, but I wanted to ask people, so if maybe you want to unmute yourselves, how would you define economic equity?
Hi there. My name is Marie, and I'll give a response. I think my perception is that people are able to provide for themselves and their families without having to burden unduly like responsibilities. Like these families where people are working 3, 4 jobs amongst 2 people is not realistic. So that people can access what they need to care for themselves and their families.
Mm-hmm. Working a full-time job should support your family.
Yeah. This is Courtney Schroeder. If we talk about the idea of equality, meaning that everyone has a level playing field, then equity is making sure that you actually take into account historical, historical facts and that have left people on a different playing field. And so for me, equity looks like making up for, historic redlining, historic, segregation, things that have actually left people on an equal footing. And so it's not just leveling the playing ground, but it's also finding ways to bring people to a place where they can actually compete.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes. I would
This is
love.
Dr.
Go ahead.
This is Dr. Bell. I would have to agree with the last two people. Equity to me, it means that we all have a level playing field. It means that the same rights and privileges and abilities that one group has, the other group has that same access to. Equity means that there is an evening out so that we are able to come to the same thing at once. And I think specifically in the realm of economics, it's critically important for people of color.
Thank you. Yes. A couple more.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
Can I, if I could? My name is James, and I was actually typing this to my mother yesterday that equity, well, it wasn't specifically about equity, but it was about dignity in life and work. Being able to have dignity in what you do, and then being able to have that dignity in what you're able to enjoy. Yeah. There seems to be something synonymous about equity and dignity. I think that's something that is there.
Totally. Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, good morning, Judy.
Mm-hmm. Good morning.
Hey, this is Anthony.
Oh, hey, Anthony.
Good morning. This is Anthony with the Standing Foundation. I think for me, equity, especially economic equity, directly implies a redistribution of economic resources, wealth, and those things around power that really recognize and rectify the historical injustices, and particularly those related to structural racism, so that communities who have been historically oppressed can actually achieve optimal outcomes in their quest for living well.
Yes, absolutely. A couple more.
Hi, Joey, this is Cindy from Visit St. Paul. So I guess actually I agree with Anthony, and I think that equity is about each person being able to afford and be able to receive something that they want without hardship. So if they would not have, for example, the redlining, right? So that would be a hardship. And I think that if we're all can get that same opportunity without a hardship, that would be equity to me.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Frida Alvarez, pronouns she, hers. And going off of that, what Anthony said, to me, economic equity would mean reparations. Economic equity is tracing back the history of how white folks in this country got their wealth. A lot can trace it back, that got their wealth to the Homestead Act of 1862, I believe. And so economic equity for me means reparations.
Thank you. It's important. So you all are just so smart. So I'm going to go back to remedial level with my answers. Was there any last one that somebody burning to share? Okay, so Faith, if we could just do one forward. Oh no, it's not going to go how I wanted. Okay, anyways, so I think when people think about economic equity, clearly not this group, but I think in a very primary, basic thinking about it, people are thinking about access to jobs, income, ownership, maybe access to capital to start a business, and as Anthony said, the distribution of wealth, and how that happens in our communities. And if we go then, maybe go to the next one. Oh, okay. So did you reformatted it? Okay. So then the kind of the next level are kind of these intersections, right? So in order for people to be successful in work and gaining livable wages, things of that sort, we need to have access to transportation. People need to be able to have quality education, stable housing, access to health, a political voice, right? And so there's these intersection cofactors too when we're talking about economic development, that we also have to be considering these other aspects. And so if we go to the next one, which is where you guys already were, is that when we're thinking about these pieces, we have to be really specific about who we're talking about, and being targeted in the communities that we know who are experiencing the kind of layers of systemic oppression that have kept us behind and created these disparities. And so as we think about, again, jobs and income and then transportation and housing, we also need to be thinking about the communities that we're targeting is in the culture, the history, the systemic white supremacy that we've all experienced that prevents us from accessing a lot of things. The building of resilience for our community, so the very asset-based approach as well. Access to wellness and healing, which I think is very real right now, as COVID keeps a lot of our clinics at a very nominal level, our healing spaces closed because of lack of gathering. We need access to wellness and healing to be successful. And of course, visibility. Again, I think that connects to the movement towards Black Lives Matter and making sure that we recognize everybody in our communities and valuing them. So when I think about the role of businesses in our communities, obviously the primary role is to provide goods and services, right? And so another primary role that I just want to be mindful of when we think about immigrant and Black, Indigenous, people of color owned businesses or BIPOC, that a lot of our communities actually start businesses because we can't get jobs. It's not to say that there's not an entrepreneurial spirit, there absolutely is. And a lot of people also start businesses because the system of workforce system doesn't work for them, right? And or they can't find a good employer that treats them with respect and allows them to advance. And so people start their own business to be able to earn money for themselves, be their own boss, but also to employ their own community. And so I just want to be mindful of that for our immigrant and BIPOC businesses. And the other role, the less tangible but very real, well, some of them are tangible, but very concrete role a business has is in strengthening our communities. And so this is where we really look to you as like the St. Paul Area Chamber, the businesses of downtown and our neighborhoods, is to strengthen our communities as well. And so there are 5 roles that I could kind of categorize that I see businesses having, being a connector, an investor, an employer, a nurturer, and a servant leader to our communities. So if we go forward. So for a connector, it's how do we how do we create space for people to come together? I had been working with the Towerside Innovation District over kind of in the Prospect Park area, and they were creating an innovation district. And one of the things that they talked about that innovation districts seek to do is to have, I forget exactly what they call it, but it was like spontaneous collisions. So how do you get people to collide in a way that allows them to start communicating and connecting, right? A community bulletin board could be that, could be having, you know, forcing people to share tables if you're a restaurant. But how do you create a space that forces people to interact with each other so that we can have conversations and get to know each other and know who we're living with, right? So if we go to the next one, the investor. So as a person in the community, I think we're always thinking about how we invest in our communities. And again, an example is hosting events. A lot of businesses host events for the community. Community actually is really needing spaces to be able to host events. So if you do have a space that community can use for free, I think that would be fantastic. Sponsoring community events, and that gives you visibility as well, so that community can see that, hey, whatever business really cares about us and really, you know, this is an important event in our community and they're wanting to be a part of it, and gives you that kind of visibility by investing in them. But also there's the last tangible of mentoring, right? Creating internships for young people, creating opportunities for young people to learn about what you do so that they might want to aspire to go into your line of business. So it's really playing a leadership role in the community as well of investment. So, okay. Obviously, another key role is being an employer. And just to emphasize, if you're hiring local, really creates that connection again. When you are hiring local, if you're like a retail business or a you know, outward facing business, and customers come in and they see their neighbors there, that makes a deeper connection, right? It helps create, make you into a part of the community when people start seeing each other there, again, kind of that spontaneous collisions happening, that having people from the community lets the people who come into your business feel comfortable and more at home and welcome. At the Alliance, we're talking about how do you create spaces that are inclusive and create inclusivity and belonging. And very core to that is having people that look like you in the business. In addition to that, you know, we talked about the 5 senses of, you know, the spaces just, you know, feel and look and smell, and the music just reflects who we are. And then of course there's the energy that gets created by that. And so again, hiring locally and having local employees can help you create that as well. And then nurturer, again, this comes out of the conversations we've been having at the Alliance about how do we create inclusive spaces, or when do we feel like we really belong. And a lot of the conversation focused on nurturing, you know, how do we take care of each other? Looking at what's going on in the wake of the protests and what happened to, you know, our businesses that were on the side of the protests, and the way the community came out, right? That is that's the nurturing spirit that community has and creates. And so you as a business, if you are able to be able to actively take care of your community through having that space that really feels and smells and tastes like the community, by investing in that in the community, by really recognizing the history of the community. Like if you were in Rondo, I use the example of Golden Time in St. Paul, right? So Golden Time, there's no way you cannot know that you're in Rondo neighborhood among historic Rondo residents, right? And or people who really deeply care about the history of Rondo. And as opposed to going into a space that might, like a Starbucks, which, I kind of say is like race blind, environment, just like race blind policies, it creates unintentional consequences that makes people feel more or less comfortable. And we all know that race blind policies are really based in historically white supremacist values. And so similar to the white spaces, it may feel like equality and that everybody can be there. But we know from the example of Starbucks, when there were those men that were sitting in the restaurant, they called the police for loitering, right? And so Starbucks had to change their policies to be more welcoming. So there is a way to create that value and culture within your space. And then one more, I think. Servant leader. And so as a servant leader, it's really about caring about the community. Some businesses are community leaders in their communities, but it is also being a servant leader to the community that you're in. So if you're not from the community, you want to follow the lead of the community. You do not want to be imposing your values and your perspective on the community. One of the things that makes me think of is, again, thinking about George Floyd and the fact that store called the police, and just kind of what happens in general in our communities is the idea of safety and what feels safe can be very different between the Black community, Black, brown communities, and the white community. We see what's going on along the transit system, and to mainstream white culture, the solution is more policing, right? And to Black and brown people who feel over-policed and threatened with the additional presence, our solution would be to create more compassion, right? And so there are, like, I forget what they're called, but ambassadors, like transit ambassadors that community have been advocating for, who can then connect with persons who might be using transit as for housing, or persons who maybe loitering in the spaces, but having a connection with people is always a better solution than imposing upon people, right? And so I think similar for being a servant, maybe I'm making stretches, but and connection to being servant leader, really listening to the community about what they want, what they need, and then working to create that type of space for people in your business. So, one of the things that also I meant to talk about too, and before doing all of this, because I keep saying community, and I'm sure that people often are like, what do you mean by community? And from the Alliance perspective, when we think about community and the communities that should be thought most specifically about, create more consideration, for those communities that have been most harmed by systems of oppression, right? Because by addressing all of these factors, connecting, investing, employing, nurturing, being servant to, by doing all of those things, you're creating a healing process for those communities that have been historically most harmed or oppressed by the systems that have kept the disparities going. And so it's that strengthening communities, strengthening those communities most harmed are going to have the greatest impact. Okay. Okay, Faith. So I think that we were intending to have some conversation. I probably went long, I apologize. But I really encourage all of you as businesses to think about how you apply these aspects to your business. And so I have 3 questions for you. One is, does your business or do your business's mission and values reflect these roles? Is that part of what you seek to be in the community that you are in? And then the next question is, does your business evaluate impact by numeric outcomes, or does your business evaluate impact by how its equity goals change its institutional policies and practices? And that's thinking about, that question comes from my thinking about how oftentimes diversity and inclusion thinks about how many employees do we have from this category, or how many applicants might we've gotten from this category, and how many people are visiting this place from these different categories. And yes, the change of policies can change those numbers, but if you're not thinking about how you institutionally are embodying equity and change, those numbers are only going to be passing, right? For as long as you do whatever it was that you did to get those numbers. And so it's about transformative change of how you do business. That's important when you're thinking about equity. And then the last question is, how often are your actions and policies made within a race-blind mindset, AKA for everyone or status quo? And just a reminder that race-blind policies are rooted in white supremacist culture, right? And so, you know, I just want to link it to in policy and zoning, the Metropolitan Council created this definition called ACP 50. It's areas of concentrated poverty, and it used to be called racial areas of concentrated poverty. And for me, what that does is it ignores the layers of systems that create that place, right? And so we think about, you know, a policy of how do we determine where bus stops are? Seems race neutral, right? Well, if we just go by numbers, you know, we'll do this or that. But if you're not thinking about who's using it and why are they using it, who's reliant on it, and the incomes of people relying on it and using that space, and maybe there's less people in this place, but, you know, you need to be thinking more specifically, like just like everybody spoke about in the earlier part around equity, you need to be thinking more specifically about who you are thinking about, who is the most need, what are the factors that might be barriers for people, and be intentional, right? And so I invite Anika, people to have a conversation, or is that not what we're doing?
That's perfect. I think we had, at one point earlier, we were thinking we might ask the groups to split up, but we had so much engagement early in the discussion that we thought we'd have that conversation openly here. Juhi, thank you so much for the work that you do and the work that you lead within the Alliance to build economic equity in our space. And thank you for sharing your thoughts, ideas, perspectives, and your work with us. We would like, the question that we had for the group that we wanted to open up to everybody, we had 2. One is, based on what Juhi has just shared, she shared those really thoughtful discussion that reminded me that each of our organizations actually have an impact in many ways on mobility and transportation, on education, on housing equity and or inequities, on health and wellness, and on policy. And the question about, does your organization, or just asking ourselves the question, does our organization impact those areas with intention? And from a specifically anti-racist frame versus a race-blind frame. I think that's a really important conversation. And then the roles that we play, are we intentionally being aware? Because Juhi, I would propose that we all are, and all of our organizations are acting as a connector for someone, and some communities and some groups, and acting as an investor that impacts someone and doesn't impact or has a positive impact on some spaces and not others. We all have that. As an employer, are we paying attention to our role and our impact on who we're including and who those opportunities are being provided to? As a nurturer for someone and some groups, and we are a servant leader potentially for some groups. And so are we approaching those discussions with intention and not from a race blind place? So thank you for sharing that with us. The two questions we wanted to pose back to the group are, number one, what role does your business play in economic equity when we think about the role of connector, investor, employer, nurturer, and servant leader? What is your role? And then second, how can you and your organization or your field deploy equity-based economic practices? And so I just open it up for anybody to jump in about the role you play in economic equity and what you can do.
Anika, this is Leah Condis from Padilla. I'll go. In my opinion, it's best to do something versus doing nothing. And, you know, maybe for people who are just starting out on this journey, starting with something small and manageable, like looking at where you spend your money. So if you typically hire, now I'm kind of going back to pre-COVID days, but if you typically hired like a caterer or a photographer for your events, are you looking at a diverse set of vendors, and could you spread those dollars around to more diverse communities? So that's just one example of a simple first step that you could maybe take to get you going on that journey.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Where do you spend your money? I think that's an important question for us all to ask ourselves, because we are spending it somewhere and we're making an impact somewhere. So that's a lever that we all can be more intentional about. Thank you so much. Anybody else that can chime in?
Anika, this is Dr. Bell. I see our role as specifically as pastors and churches in the area of connector. One of the things that we are intentional about is if we're doing programs to make sure that we use Black businesses in order to facilitate feeding or providing services and those kinds of pieces. But I see us as connectors. We have a lot of entrepreneurs, and so we are often connecting them to different loans or grant programs, through the state, through the government, through the denomination, but just trying to make the playing field as even as possible by utilizing our resources to advocate for and use Black businesses.
Wonderful, thank you. Absolutely, in our community, our pastors are being connectors, and I think we have a lot to learn from that. Juhi, any thoughts?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's fantastic, and I love that people are using those words because I think that's a great starting point, is to see where you're at, and then where you can strengthen and or if you're doing it already, reinforce it, and then, like you said, Anika, are you being intentional behind it? Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much, Juhi. Any other thoughts or comments that you all can share to the question, what role does your business play in economic equity, or what roles are you seeing other businesses play, and how can we deploy equity-based economic practices?
This is Ken Smith. I really appreciate the comments today. For our business, the first thing, as leader of the business, was to start with myself and to see where I was at and what gaps did I have in my own knowledge. Where was I blind? And so to be a servant leader, I needed to take an account of myself first and encourage others on my leadership team to do the same. But as an employer, we're looking at policies just across our organization. And we're finding things as we first look at ourselves and understand where we have this blindness, as you have on the slide, to then be able to see more clearly where we have challenges. And we've used outside consultants to help us find these things that were right in front of us the whole time, but we didn't see it before. And so that's what we're doing as an employer.
That's fantastic. I think that's the we're realizing that we all see part of this issue, and we're all not capable of seeing a part of this issue until we find ways to get there. And so one of the articles I read recently talked about 2 Minnesotas and how, you know, part of us are seeing this beautiful Minnesota that we are so proud of, and part of us are seeing the yeah buts and how it's not happening for so many folks, and it's really difficult to see both lenses. I think we've got wonderful folks in institutions who can tell when the institution is not seeing all the pieces of the puzzle, and that can come in and help support us in getting there. And so we have to figure out how to use our resources to get those folks, to hire them in our organizations and to contract with them. But ultimately we need our leadership to build their skills, build their vision, their ability to see. So thank you so much for the work that you all are doing. Ken, anybody else?
Hi, this is Bonnie Vogel of Vogel Mechanical, so working in the construction realm, and I really appreciate your comments, Johi, about connection versus imposing. Just being on multiple sides of goals, and how like imposing goals doesn't always create connection and an authentic business relationship. So I don't know that I have a specific answer for it, but I know what it looks like and feels like. And I know that connection would certainly create all of these connection, investing, being a nurturer and servant leader if we were really coming at it from a space of connection. But I know that the goals also have us do that when we aren't willing to, but it's just more of an inquiry, I guess, at this point for me. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bonnie. Juhi, I want to make sure you have a chance to follow up on any of these questions or comments.
No, I love the reflecting that's happening, and that's the intention.
Absolutely. Anyone else?
Anika, this is Kevin Lindsay from the Minnesota Humanities Center. First off, Johi, thank you for the presentation. That was great. Anika, thank you for facilitating the conversation. One of the things that I'm struck by is the balancing, I think, that you're asking all businesses to undertake of sort of their short-term and sort of their long-term investment. So we can think about the idea of, am I going to make this quarter this investment and make decisions on from a profit bottom line standpoint? Do I have more dimes, nickels, and quarters than I had prior to the quarter at the beginning and at the end? And then I think what you're asking for is, do you make long-term investments so you diversify your pool of employees, your pool of business vendors, and you shape the environment around you, that you have a strong public school system, you have a strong infrastructure, you have a strong democracy that protects your business and your intellectual property. So to that extent, I guess the question you're really posing as leaders of organizations, how do we strike a better balance than what we have had in the past? And I would be really curious, because sometimes I think some of the efforts that have been identified and been imposed from the civil rights have been viewed as being very punitive in the short term, when actually they set forward an opportunity to have a real conversation about the long-term benefits and growth of our country.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kevin. I think that for me feels like the point of the entire conversation is that we are asking questions of ourselves as business leaders about what is the overall impact that we're making in community, because we are making an impact, and how are we participating? I appreciate the context about balance. How are we creating a balance between, for me, I think about how we're creating a balance between making a profit and making sure the business is viable and the business is strong, and making sure our impact on community is making sure that the community is strong and that we are participating in building infrastructure, et cetera. So thank you for that. We've got time for one more thought or reflection or question for Juhi.
I think their question is really about details. Last one you talked.
Hi, Judy. Good morning. This is Anthony. I have a question. Is there, when we're talking about systems change in many of the areas that we're talking about, is there right now some way that we're asking a question and there's an urgency for a new social contract between business generally and the communities that they're working with, where we are going to allow for different kinds of outcomes of measurement and success? Because I think that, although this all makes sense, there's something fundamental about our system around economics, and that ultimately Black people, brown people, women, low to moderate income people, and sometimes just become viewed as a market, and that there's something fundamentally that possibly changed, that we need to ask for change in that. And so is that also fundamental to where we are headed in this next iteration of the system that we are participating in?
Yeah, I think, like Anika said, as business leaders, we're making an impact, and whether we're intending it or not, right? And and are we making the impact that we actually want to be making? And so what I'm proposing in this presentation is to be intentional about the impact you make. And it is an investment in the future of our business, but our businesses are only successful if our communities are successful. Our businesses are only successful if our employees are successful, right? And so we have to think beyond our walls of our business and think about what happens outside, not in the physical space, but then also what happens outside for your employees. And so kind of like in the conversation we had when I was with you in the Science Museum, you took me so long to remember that now I forgot what I was going to say, but we need to be intentional. In order to advance equity, it's not just about our bottom line. I mean, the distribution of wealth that got brought up, I saw somewhere that Jeff Bezos is on his way to be a trillionaire, right? And we see all these union fights on at the warehouses, fighting for better working conditions. How can you justify becoming a trillionaire, right? How is he, during COVID, we're all buying from, ashamedly buying from Amazon instead of our local businesses because our local businesses are closed. And so we're kind of forced into it. And that's obviously clearly not equity, right? So Jeff Bezos, if we're going to use Jeff Bezos as an example, he should really be checking himself and thinking about, these employees and their children as the future and investing in them, right? And investing in the communities that are supporting him, because we can't buy anything more if we don't have any money either. The disparities is just, it's just appalling to me, the difference that's happening. The 1% becomes 0.1% that has all the wealth. And I know that's not what we're talking about, But as businesses in our local communities, we have an absolute obligation and role to think about the communities that your business sits in, that gives you money for whatever your goods or services, that are working for you to make you successful, and putting more value into that, because that together also creates our future.
Thank you so much, Juhi, for the wisdom and the information that you shared with us. I want to make one more note and then turn the conversation over to Shannon to close us out. The conversations that we've been having today remind me of two things. One, I got a chance to listen to Professor Ephraim X. Kendi speak about the fact that anti-racism is the opposite of racism, and that there is no neutral, there is no race neutral, because you either are having a positive impact or a negative impact. And so as we think about racism, rather than thinking about what our heart, where our heart is as we act, let's think about what our impact is. And our impact is always one way or another. We just, the University of Minnesota just made a really interesting decision to disinvest in the Minneapolis Police Department. And there was an article in the Pioneer Press that Abdul Omari, who's on the Board of Regents, did an interview with the Pioneer Press and spoke about this very concept, that you have to be very intentional about your impact, otherwise you're having a negative impact and there is no neutral. And I would say that that's the conversation that we want to think about, the fact that, you know, if we're not intentional about our impact, then we are definitely having a negative impact. So thank you and in order to have a positive impact, we have to be very intentional, and very intentional means we're not neutral. I want to turn it over to Shannon to close us out. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Juhi, for that wonderful construct and framework to help us take all of the complexities and put it into a model that we can actually act on. Whether we are talking about the primary or the intersection of cofactors or the intangibles of economic equity, we have an opportunity to really change the way we do business. And I'm getting a message that you may not be able to hear me. Some of you are hearing me. Okay. But the opportunity is before us. There are things that we can do, whether or not our organizations are investing in a little league field. Do we do it in a community that always has great resources, or are we investing in the zip codes where we're seeing the greatest economic disparity? If there is an affordable housing plan in our neighborhoods, are we part of the NIMBY group that says, not my backyard? Are we understanding that income diversity is really important for the wealth and mobility of all people and the richness and the texture in our society? And do we support housing and the ability for people to live in communities where they want to, not just because they have to? So many different things that we can look at. We are champions of change working together. Is your business a connector, an investor, an employer, a nurturer, and a servant leader? And how are you leveraging that? And how are we personally driving change? Never enough time in these conversations. This is the last of the equity briefs. We pivoted due to COVID. We stopped our equity series. We ask you to join us next week, June 10th at 7:30 in the morning. You can wear your PJs, maybe, but 7:30 in the morning. And we are going to have Tanya Hampton and Ellie Krug. We're going to talk about the very difficult discussion of race and how we have historically built systems based on a perspective of one segment of our society, and how we can look at our organizations to drive constructive change and dismantle, as Kevin was talking about, the long-term game. How do we begin to change our systems? That's the question, right? So please join us on June 10th. I will say that there is a fee for that event. It's very difficult. We are a business. We have pivoted to offer these for free, but we ask that you consider maybe making a donation to support people who are now unemployed and not able to cover that cost. And I invite anyone who is looking for the ability to participate without a fee to reach out directly with me, just because we know that we're all in it together. So I'll stop where I started, which is together we can make it happen. Thank you for your commitment to this work. Thank you for all that you are doing. And we hope to see you June 10th. Be good, be safe, and be kind.
Thank you.
Have a great day, guys.